Are you the kind of person that gets yourself in trouble? When everybody else is in a group and everyone's kind of messing around, somehow you're always the one who gets caught and you're always the one who ends up taking the blame for it? Well, if you are, then you're just like Jesus in that sense. He was always getting himself in trouble as well. I remember when I was in school, I would find myself in a lot of trouble, and I have to admit, it was my own fault. We'd be in class and we'd be at the back and we'd be talking and laughing and making jokes. When the teacher would look around, the person she saw laughing was always me. So I'm always the one that was told, okay, go out the room, Jonathan, out the room. And I spent more of my time at school in the corridor than perhaps was good for my education. But anyhow, getting in trouble can sometimes fill you with a sense of exhilaration. It kind of makes you feel like a rebel with a cause. But sometimes we do things, or people do things, simply to be contrary, simply to go against the system, simply to be against the group. And this is not really what Jesus did. When he got himself in trouble, he was doing so always because he was advocating for someone else. Now, let me see if I can explain this in a brief story here in the Gospel of Mark. The last time we talked about how Jesus was trying to include those who were excluded. And today we're talking about how Jesus did his best to liberate the Sabbath. Now, some of you may be familiar with the concept of the Sabbath, others of you may not be. The Sabbath really is a day that God gave to humanity right at the beginning of creation. In the Bible, in Genesis, it talks about how at the end of the 6 days of creation, God made this special day. And really, this was a day for freedom. This was a day for humanity to embrace the fact that they are not machines, that their value does not come from what they do or what they produce, but simply from who they are. And also it was a day for faith, a day for spending time with God, but most importantly, a day for family, a day for laying aside busyness and hurry and work and just spending time with the people who matter most. And God gave this to humanity because even before we had a broken world like we do now, God recognized that we needed a day for freedom. We needed a day for faith and for family, because this day would contribute to our ongoing health. We would be healthier and we would be whole if we took one complete 24-hour period of every week just to relax and to relate. And so this was God's intention. But flash forward a couple thousand years, there's a man called Abraham, and he has some kids and they have some kids. And eventually these people become known as the Hebrews or Israelites or the Jews. And God reminds them about this day that he gave to everyone. And they're like, okay, that's great. But after a while, they start to do what honestly, a lot of groups of Christians, a lot of groups of faith organizations do. They start to make walls and boundaries and barriers around stuff. So this now becomes not just the Sabbath for the world, the Sabbath for humanity, but our Sabbath. And they start adding all these rules to it, all these bells and whistles that like no one really needs. Like there was this rule that you couldn't spit on the Sabbath. And here was the logic, right? If you spit on the Sabbath, your saliva might accidentally fall on like seed or the seed of some wheat or something, and it might water it and it might start growing, and there you would have been farming on the Sabbath. You'd been working and you'd have ruined the whole thing. And they had lots of really ridiculous rules like this. And so Jesus often found himself trying to liberate the day of freedom from the people who it was supposed to be setting free. So there's this one time where on the Sabbath, Jesus is with his friends, and I guess no one's invited them for lunch, and they're walking through this field and they're hungry, so they start picking just bits of grain through this field and they're rubbing it in their hands and they're eating it. Now, I've done this before. Eating raw grain is not very nice. It doesn't taste good. It's got no flavor, but that's what they're doing. And somehow there's someone with a long lens camera, or they're hiding in the bushes, and they're like, oh, you're breaking the Sabbath. How dare you eat wheat on the Sabbath? How dare you pick it? You should be hungry on the day of rest. Wait, that doesn't make sense. But let's not think about that. How could you do this? And so Jesus finds himself trying to explain that, listen, David and others, when they were hungry, they had food. What's the problem? So now he gets this reputation as a Sabbath breaker. So one day Jesus is at another synagogue. I guess this synagogue leader didn't know he was on the banned list of preachers. So they invite him to preach, and there are people in the room who are just watching. They're just waiting to see if he's going to do something so that they can accuse him. And sure enough, in the audience, there is a man who has a withered hand. He has had this condition for some time. And they're like, oh, Jesus likes healing people. There's someone here who needs healing. He better not heal on the Sabbath. And so they're watching him. And Jesus actually notices what's going on. And we're going to pick it up here in Mark chapter 3. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Now that's an awkward moment, right? And then Jesus asks them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. Jesus was trying to expose them to their obvious hypocrisy, the obvious contradiction in their thinking. They were so concerned about the Sabbath that they had lost sight of the very reason why it was given in the first place. It is a problem when people care more about their traditions than about how they treat others. It is a problem when we care more about our policies than people. And Jesus always came against this. In verse 5, we read this. He, that's Jesus, looked around at them in anger. This is one of the only times that the Bible records that Jesus was angry. And why was he angry? Because they didn't like his sermon? No. Because they had questions about his Sabbath keeping etiquette? No. His anger was because they were more interested in being right than in the welfare of this person right in front of them. And so Jesus turns to the man and says, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. The amazing thing about this is that this one act of healing, these few words from Jesus, simultaneously heal and release and free this man's hand, and at the same time harden the stubborn hearts of his opponents. And here's how the story ends. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So they start the story really concerned about Sabbath breaking and Sabbath keeping, and they end the story leaving church midway through on the Sabbath to meet with the Herodians, who are like a political party of the day, to plot how to kill Jesus. Like that's how insane their stubbornness and their pride got. We need to be very, 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 very careful when we are more concerned about maintaining our opinions and our ideas at the expense of those who we may be hurting. And even when we are confronted about it, we just refuse because, you know what, we just don't want to look wrong. That's not the kind of trouble that Jesus was in. That's not the kind of, well, everyone's going that way, I'm just going to stick to my guns. That's not what Jesus was doing. Jesus was constantly looking to advocate for those who were not able to advocate for themselves. I pray that the Sabbath is a blessing in your life. I pray that you have a day that you can spend experiencing freedom in God, developing your faith and with family. But more importantly, I pray that you become a Sabbath to the world, that you go and bring freedom and healing and faith wherever you go. And yes, you may encounter some people who think you are a fool for that. But in the words of Michael Card, I simply say, hey, we are following after God's own fool, for only the foolish can tell. Only we can believe the unbelievable. Why don't you come be a fool as well?